June 4, 1942. Dawn over the Pacific. The ocean lies still, a sheet of liquid glass beneath a pale rising sun. For Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu cut through the calm, their decks alive with precision. Pilots check harnesses, crews load torpedoes, officers sip green tea, convinced that the Empire of Japan stands untouchable. Above, the air smells of salt and aviation fuel, the scent of confidence. The captains glance across the horizon, murmuring about American weakness. To them, Midway is not a battle. It's a cleanup. They believe no one can reach them. No enemy could even find them in this vast blue desert. But hundreds of miles away, American codebreakers already know their every move. And in the skies beyond the clouds, U.S. bombers are closing in unseen, silent, guided by decoded whispers from a hidden station in Hawaii. In less than an hour, the laughter on these decks will turn to screams, and the calm Pacific will catch fire. Fire. This is the Battle of Midway, the moment arrogance met intelligence. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to WWII Heroic Realism, where real history is told like a cinematic film, one story at a time. When the sun rose over the Pacific in early 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at the height of its power. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Tokyo's war machine had swept across Asia like a storm, from the jungles of Malaya to the islands of the Philippines, from Burma to the Dutch East Indies. In less than half a year, Japan had seized a territory larger than Hitler's entire European conquest. To the Japanese military, it seemed proof that destiny favored the rising sun. Their naval doctrine, built around fast carriers and aggressive tactics, had shattered Western myths of superiority. The Imperial Navy had humbled the Americans at Pearl Harbor, crushed the British fleet at Singapore, and humiliated colonial powers who once ruled the seas. At the center of this triumph stood one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. A gambler, strategist, and visionary, Yamamoto had warned his nation about awakening the sleeping giant of American industry. But once the war began, he knew hesitation would mean defeat. So he designed a plan to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap so decisive that America would never rise again. That trap was Midway, a tiny atoll halfway between Hawaii and Japan. Midway was the last American outpost guarding the Pacific. Destroy it, and Japan could extend its defensive perimeter, threatening Hawaii itself. Capture it, and Washington would be forced to negotiate. By late May 1942, the plan was in motion. For carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the strike force, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and battleships under Yamamoto's distant command. The Japanese fleet moved with confidence born from 6 months of unstoppable victories. But beneath that confidence lay cracks. The Imperial Navy had lost its edge in intelligence, blinded by success and arrogance. They assumed American morale was broken, their fleet crippled, and their aircraft carriers destroyed. They didn't know that U.S. codebreakers at Station HYPO in Hawaii had cracked the heart of Japan's naval communications. Commander Joseph Rockefort, working in secrecy, had deciphered enough of the Japanese code JN-25 to identify Midway as the next target. It wasn't confirmed until an ingenious trick. The Americans sent a false radio message claiming Midway's water distillation plant had failed. When Japanese intercepts later reported that AF is short on water, the ruse worked. AF was Midway. Now Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew exactly where and when the Japanese would strike. And unlike Yamamoto, he didn't plan to react, he planned to ambush. As Japanese ships advanced under the illusion of surprise, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, moved into position northeast of Midway. Hidden by the vast Pacific, they waited like hunters beneath calm waters. The Japanese thought they were chasing ghosts. In truth, they were sailing into a storm of their own making. The stage was set, arrogance against calculation, faith against information. And in that tension lay the turning point of the Pacific War. The Pacific in early June 1942 was a deceptive calm. Sunlight glittering across endless blue, the sound of engines distant and steady. Yet beneath that serenity, two armadas moved on converging paths, unaware that fate had already chosen its battlefield. For Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Midway was a desperate gamble, a battle America could not afford to lose. The memory of Pearl Harbor still burned, and the Pacific was vast enough to swallow entire fleets without a trace. The U.S. Navy was outnumbered, outgunned, and still reeling from months of retreat. But it had one advantage Japan did not: information. Nimitz knew Yamamoto's plan almost to the hour. The Japanese believed they would ambush an American fleet rushing to defend Midway. Instead, they were the ones walking into the crosshairs. On Midway Atoll itself, men worked feverishly to prepare. U.S. Marines fortified the beaches. Anti-aircraft guns were dug in along the lagoon. Pilots of Marine Air Group 22, many barely out of flight school, practiced bombing runs on coral reefs that stood in for enemy ships. The airfield roared day and night as B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-26 Marauders arrived from Hawaii. To them, the island felt impossibly small, just two narrow strips of sand in the middle of the ocean, 1,300 miles northwest of Oahu. But they understood its importance. Midway was the last shield before the Hawaiian Islands. Lose it, and the Japanese could strike Pearl Harbor again or worse. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, confidence reigned. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force, studied reports claiming the American carriers were nowhere near the area. Japanese reconnaissance flights were limited, and communication delays between their scattered fleets added to the illusion of control. Nagumo's pilots were the pride of the Empire, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. They believed the Americans were inferior, slow to react, and poorly trained. Their aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was faster and more agile than any U.S. fighter. Their doctrine emphasized precision and honor. They saw themselves as the heirs of samurai, men for whom defeat was not an option. But unseen forces were already closing in. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, sailed under strict radio silence. Hidden beneath overcast skies, their pilots studied maps and photographs, memorizing Japanese formations. Each squadron commander knew what was at stake. On the damaged Yorktown, repair crews had performed what engineers later called a miracle. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, she had limped home with severe damage, but within just 72 hours, she was patched, refitted, and sent back into action. Her decks still smelled of oil and welding sparks as her crew took battle stations once again. The Americans had no illusions about their odds. Their dive bombers were slower, their torpedo planes outdated. But they carried something the Japanese underestimated: resilience and the element of surprise. At dawn on June 3, 1942, a U.S. patrol plane spotted something glinting on the horizon. A Japanese transport group, heading straight for Midway. The alarm was raised. Many ships heading east. The stage was now set for one of the most decisive naval battles in human history. In the hours ahead, courage would clash with calculation. And when the first smoke rose over the horizon, the myth of Japan's invincibility would begin to crumble. 1. The tactical angle, the art of ambush in open ocean. The Battle of Midway was not decided by brute force, but by foresight. Admiral Nimitz had studied Yamamoto's plan like a chessboard, each Japanese carrier, cruiser, and support ship positioned as though confidence alone would protect them. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his fleet had already been outmaneuvered, not on the sea, but in the invisible world of signals intelligence. The U.S. Navy's decision to place its carriers northeast of Midway, directly across the Japanese flight path, was an act of audacity. It defied naval convention. No commander in history had ever hidden 3 carriers in the vast Pacific and waited to ambush a force that outnumbered them 2-1. When the first Japanese waves launched toward Midway on June 4, Nagumo believed total surprise was his. His bombers streaked over the atoll at 4:30 a.m., unleashing fire and smoke. The island shook under the barrage. Yet while Nagumo was preparing a second strike to finish off the defenses, his scouts were late, fatally late, in locating the American carriers. By the time they did, chaos was brewing on his decks. His crews were refueling and rearming planes when the message came in, "Enemy carriers sighted." In that moment, tactics turned to disaster. Bombs and fuel lines covered the decks, a deadly mix waiting for a spark. 2. The technological angle, machines that defined fate. Technology, too, shaped Midway's destiny. The Japanese had the faster, more agile Zero. Their carrier air wings were seasoned and precise. Yet, the Americans possessed tools that offset these advantages. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber, slow but steady, would become the weapon that broke the back of the Japanese carrier force. It was not elegant, it was rugged. Pilots described flying it as riding a steel anvil through the sky. But its ability to dive nearly vertical, steady under anti-aircraft fire, and drop bombs with deadly accuracy made it a silent equalizer. Then there was the Mark 13 torpedo, infamous for its failures earlier in the war. At Midway, it again disappointed. Many torpedoes missed or failed to detonate. Yet the men who flew those torpedo runs did something that no technology could replicate. They drew the enemy fire away. While Japanese Zeros dove to intercept the low-flying American torpedo bombers, the skies above opened for the dauntless squadrons diving from altitude. Courage, not circuitry, bridged the technological gap. Even radar, still in its infancy, played its part. Midway's early warning radar detected the inbound Japanese bombers minutes before they struck, giving defenders time to man anti-aircraft guns. For the first time, electronic eyes were changing how wars were fought. The Japanese had faith in experience and machinery. The Americans in improvisation and adaptation. That difference, invisible to the naked eye, was about to decide everything. 3. The human angle, courage measured in minutes. For all its scale, Midway was a battle of individuals. Lieutenant John Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8 knew his orders. Attack the Japanese fleet no matter the cost. He led 15 planes from the Hornet into the sky, outdated TBD Devastators, slow and underarmed. Every man in that formation knew what awaited them. None turned back. Zeros swarmed them, slicing through their formation. One by one, Waldron's planes fell flaming into the sea. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating alone amid wreckage, watching the battle unfold from the waves. Their attack achieved nothing tactically, but strategically it changed everything. By forcing the Japanese fighters low, they left the skies above open for the dauntless dive bombers. Minutes later, those same skies would rain destruction. Midway proved that courage could shape history, even when it seemed meaningless in the moment. 4. The psychological angle, pride, arrogance, and fear. The Battle of Midway was also a war of minds. The Japanese high command believed in the perfection of their tactics. Their victories had been swift, their losses few. That confidence hardened into arrogance. They expected to face panic and disorganization. Instead, they faced calculation and discipline. American crews, many fighting their first major battle, carried something the Japanese had forgotten: humility born of defeat. The memory of Pearl Harbor still haunted them. Every man knew what was at stake. The Japanese underestimated their enemy. The Americans overestimated their foe. That mental balance, fear against pride, tilted the scales. By the time the first explosions tore through the morning sky, both sides would realize that Midway was not a battle of strength, but of perception. 5. The command decisions, seconds that changed history. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding from Pearl Harbor, never saw the battle unfold with his eyes. Only through radio transmissions, coded messages, and silence between them. Yet, his calm decisions shaped every move of the American fleet. He trusted two things above all: intelligence and intuition. When Codebreakers led by Joseph Rockefort cracked part of Japan's naval cipher, JN-25, they identified AF as Midway. Nimitz didn't hesitate. He deployed all available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to intercept the Japanese fleet. His gamble rested on one belief: that Yamamoto's plan was predictable, and that his enemy's pride would make him blind to deception. It worked. In contrast, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, believed he could lure the American fleet into destruction by using Midway as bait. But he misjudged timing and communication. His vast fleet, spread over 2,500 miles of ocean, operated with poor coordination, a fatal flaw in what should have been a masterstroke. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, faced an impossible choice when he learned of the American carrier's presence mid-battle. Should he rearm his planes for ship strikes or continue attacking Midway's island defenses? His hesitation, a mere 5 minutes, doomed 4 of Japan's frontline carriers. Those 5 minutes became one of the most decisive intervals in modern warfare. History, as it turned out, doesn't just favor the brave, it favors the decisive. 6. The intelligence angle, breaking silence, breaking fate. The victory at Midway began not on the waves, but in a basement under Pearl Harbor. It was there that Commander Joseph Rockefort and his cryptanalysts worked day and night, surrounded by cigarette smoke, maps, and machines that hummed like insects. They had been reading fragments of Japan's coded naval communications for months. But one puzzle remained. What was AF? Rockefort devised a test. Have Midway send an uncoded message claiming that their freshwater system had broken down. Within hours, Japanese radio traffic reported that AF was short on water. The code was cracked. This revelation allowed Nimitz to position his fleet exactly where Yamamoto would attack. It was, in essence, a reverse ambush, an invisible trap laid weeks before the battle even began. Midway became the first major naval battle in which information outweighed ammunition. The Japanese came expecting surprise. The Americans came expecting them. And when the trap was sprung, the Japanese command never realized how deeply they had been outsmarted. 7. The moral weight triumph amid tragedy. Victory at Midway was not clean. It was built on sacrifice. Entire squadrons vanished into smoke. The Yorktown, already damaged from earlier battles, was struck again and again. Crews fought to save her as flames consumed the deck. Even in defeat, she refused to sink quietly. When the battle was over, 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay beneath the Pacific. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators were lost. The Americans had lost 307 men, including many of the pilots whose courage had turned the tide. Strategically, Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War. But morally, it revealed the terrible symmetry of courage on both sides. Japanese sailors went down with their ships, saluting the rising sun as flames consumed them. American aviators burned in their cockpits, steering their planes into impossible dives. War, in that moment, stripped away politics and propaganda, revealing the human cost beneath every victory. Midway's story is often told as the battle that saved the Pacific, but its deeper truth is this. It was the day when 2 nations, equal in valor but divided by purpose, met at the edge of fate. 8. The legacy angle echoes beyond the waves. The shock of Midway rippled through Tokyo like thunder. Yamamoto, who once declared he would run wild for 6 months, saw the prophecy fulfilled and ended. Japan's offensive momentum was broken. Never again would it regain the initiative in the Pacific. For the United States, Midway became a symbol proof that courage, intelligence, and resolve could overcome even the most formidable enemy. It taught a generation of commanders that wars are won not only with weapons, but with information, timing, and faith in the unknown. And for history itself, Midway stands as a reminder. Even in the darkest seas, the smallest act of foresight, a code cracked, a risk taken, a choice made in 5 minutes, can change the world forever. June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll. 10:20 a.m. The Pacific was a mirror that morning, calm, endless, deceptively still. Above it, Japanese carrier decks thrummed with precision. Planes were armed, fueled, lined for the second strike on Midway. Mechanics shouted orders. The air smelled of oil and sea salt. Then a voice over the radio. Enemy carriers sighted. Northeast. Admiral Nagumo froze. His fleet had been invisible, or so he believed. Now, in seconds, everything changed. He had 2 options, both fatal. Launch immediately with bombs meant for land targets, or delay and rearm for ship attack. He hesitated. Below deck, armorers rushed to replace the weapons, torpedoes for bombs, bombs for torpedoes. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar floor, mingling with explosives. It was a fire waiting for a spark. At that exact moment, high above the clouds, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived, low on fuel, high on desperation. They had been searching for hours, guided not by radar but by instinct and courage. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's air group, spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing north at full speed, an escort ship, hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made a choice that changed history. He followed it. Minutes later, the horizon opened. For Japanese carriers below, their decks crowded, defenseless. 10:22 a.m. The first bomb struck the Kaga, pierced the flight deck and exploded among armed aircraft. The blast tore through the hangar, igniting fuel lines. Within seconds, the ship became a volcano. Men were hurled into the sea as flames devoured steel. Moments later, the Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by a single, perfectly placed bomb. It detonated near the bridge. Fire spread through the ship like liquid light. Nagumo's staff scrambled to escape, but the heat was unbearable. The once proud heart of the Japanese fleet became an inferno. The Soryu was next. 3 bombs hit her amidships, rupturing ammunition stores. Explosions cascaded through the decks. Smoke rose in black columns, staining the sky. In less than 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were ablaze. Admiral Nagumo stood in disbelief. The air was filled with the roar of fire, the screams of men, and the thunder of collapsing steel. He had lost half his fleet before Japan's counterstrike could even launch. Across the ocean, aboard the Enterprise, radio operators listened in silence. Reports came in: Akagi hit, Kaga hit, Soryu hit. There were no cheers, only quiet awe. The unthinkable had happened. The American pilots, many of them barely out of flight school, had achieved what seemed impossible. They had turned the tide of the Pacific in a single dive. But victory was far from complete. The Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, remained untouched, and she was ready to fight back. 11 a.m. The Hiryu launched her strike. Waves of Japanese dive bombers screamed down upon the Yorktown. The first hit smashed through the flight deck. The second exploded near the engine room. The third ignited aviation fuel, engulfing the carrier in fire. The crew fought for hours to save her. Smoke poured from the vents. Men formed bucket lines, refusing to abandon ship. By afternoon, the Yorktown was wounded but alive. Until the second wave arrived. 2 torpedoes slammed into her side. The ship shuddered, tilted, and began to die. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the final order: abandon ship. As sailors climbed down her burning hull, the stars and stripes still fluttered in the wind. The sea that had swallowed so many now carried the wounded and the brave. Far above, Japanese pilots returning to the Hiryu found nothing but wreckage where their comrades' carriers once stood. Smoke blanketed the Pacific like a funeral shroud. And on that horizon, American bombers appeared again. The Hiryu's crew looked up, seeing the same sight their brothers had seen that morning: silver shapes diving from the sun. 3:30 p.m. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu. 1 tore through the hangar. 1 exploded near the bridge. 2 struck the engine compartments. The ship erupted into chaos. Explosions, screams, the crash of steel and fire. By nightfall, she too was gone. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed in a single day. The same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. And with them, Japan's dreams of dominance sank beneath the waves. The sky above Midway turned red at sunset. Not with fire, but with victory and loss intertwined. The battle was won, but the cost was immense. As darkness fell, one truth became clear: the Pacific would never be the same again. Nightfall, June 4, 1942. The Pacific glowed faintly in the dark, not from moonlight, but from the burning remains of ships that once carried the pride of an empire. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were now skeletal silhouettes, their flames reflected on the waves like ghostly lanterns drifting into history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, stood aboard the battleship Yamato, his face lit by the distant glow of his shattered armada. He did not rage. He did not shout. He simply bowed his head. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese Navy had suffered a blow it could not hide or undo. For fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, more than 3,000 men, gone in a single day. Back near Midway, American patrol boats scoured the seas for survivors. They pulled men, both American and Japanese, from the oil-slicked water. Many were silent. Some wept. Others floated face up, their flight suits burned away. For the U.S. Navy, this was redemption, not vengeance, but justice. Pearl Harbor had been avenged, not by fury, but by precision, intelligence, and courage. The pilots of the Enterprise and Yorktown were greeted not with parades, but with stunned disbelief. They had rewritten the balance of the Pacific in just 5 hours. Far away in Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff received the report. At first, they refused to believe it. How could 4 carriers, the heart of the Empire's naval strength, vanish in a single battle? But as hours passed, the truth arrived with the names of the dead. Across Japan, newspapers published only fragments. The official statement called it a draw. But among those who understood, the truth was devastating. Japan had lost not just ships, but its offensive power. Its carrier-trained pilots, irreplaceable in skill and experience, were gone. Its aura of invincibility shattered. Admiral Yamamoto, a man who had once warned that war with the United States was a gamble Japan could not sustain, now faced the weight of prophecy fulfilled. He had predicted 6 months of victories. Midway marked the end of that 6th month. On the deck of the Yamato, he whispered to an aide, "The fate of the Empire has turned in one day." Then he ordered his fleet to retreat. Meanwhile, the Yorktown, battered, blackened, barely afloat, was being towed by destroyers. Her crew had fought with valor beyond measure, but the sea had other plans. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped through the escort screen. 4 torpedoes streaked through the water. 2 struck the Yorktown, 1 struck the destroyer Hammond. Within minutes, the Hammond exploded. The Yorktown began to list. Men dove into the sea as she rolled over slowly, her flag still flying. By dawn, she was gone, joining the very enemy she had helped destroy. The ocean was mercilessly equal. For Japan, the Battle of Midway was not just a defeat. It was the loss of initiative, a wound that would never heal. From that moment, the Imperial Navy would never again go on the offensive. Every move henceforth would be reaction, defense, retreat. For the United States, Midway was the awakening. It proved that courage and strategy could triumph over numbers and arrogance. The tide of the Pacific had turned, and with it, the course of World War II itself. That night, as American crews gazed out across the dark water, they saw the faint orange glow on the horizon, the last fires of the Hiryu. It was said that one pilot, watching it fade, whispered, "That's for December 7th. By dawn, only smoke and silence remained. The Pacific, once the Empire's domain, now belonged to neither victor nor vanquished, only to history. The Battle of Midway had ended, but its echoes would shape every battle that followed: Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. The momentum of war had shifted, and Japan would spend the rest of the conflict fighting against time itself. From this inferno of loss and courage, one truth emerged. Wars are not won by might alone, but by those who can learn, adapt, and endure. The morning after Midway was eerily calm. The sea, which had roared with fire and fury, now lay still, carrying the twisted remains of history upon its waves. Oil slicks shimmered under the rising sun. Lifeboats drifted silently, and beneath the Pacific's blue surface, the bones of ships and men began their long sleep. The Enterprise and Hornet cruised slowly back toward Pearl Harbor. Their decks bore the scars of battle, melted steel, burned paint, bullet holes in every direction. But there was pride too. an unspoken understanding among sailors and airmen that they had done something far greater than survive. They had turned the tide. As the carriers approached Oahu, the same harbor that had once burned under Japan's surprise attack now stood ready to welcome its defenders home. The men were greeted not with fanfare, but with salutes and quiet awe. Reporters were kept away. The details were classified. But the faces of the returning pilots said enough. Exhaustion mixed with the faint, humbled glow of victory. In Washington, the news arrived in coded fragments. At first, Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, simply nodded. He had known what was at stake. When the full scope of the victory became clear, 4 Japanese carriers destroyed, even his famously stern expression broke. President Roosevelt was briefed personally that night. He paused, then smiled faintly. "This is the turning point," he said softly. "This changes everything." The victory at Midway did not just shift the balance of power. It restored the morale of an entire nation. The United States had entered the war wounded, doubting, uncertain. Now it stood on the edge of transformation. Factories that once built cars were already turning out aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. American industry, like a giant awakening from slumber, began to stretch its full strength across the Pacific. In Tokyo, silence reigned. When the Imperial Navy's report reached the Emperor, even he was said to have fallen into stunned reflection. The report began with an apology, a word almost forbidden in the code of the Japanese warrior. It detailed the loss of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the 4 carriers that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Imperial staff knew what this meant. Without these ships, and without the elite aviators who went down with them, Japan's ability to wage offensive war across the Pacific had evaporated overnight. The factories of Nagoya and Yokosuka could build new hulls, but they could not rebuild experience. The young pilots who would follow lacked the training, instinct, and skill of those lost in the burning sea near Midway. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, intelligence officers of Station HYPO watched the reaction with quiet satisfaction. The men who had cracked Japan's naval codes, Joe Rockefort and his team, were never paraded or decorated publicly. They were not soldiers but cryptanalysts, working in dim rooms filled with cigarette smoke and static. Yet their victory had been as decisive as any bomb dropped from the sky. Rockefort, sitting at his desk that evening, received a brief message from Admiral Nimitz. "You can run a bath and shave your beard now. Job well done." Rockefort smiled faintly. He knew that while the pilots had written the story of Midway in fire, his team had written the first line of it in silence. Across the Pacific, in small towns and big cities, the story began to spread. Radio broadcasts spoke of a major victory. Families who had lost sons at Pearl Harbor felt something shift. Not relief, but purpose. The enemy could be beaten. The road ahead would still be long, but now it had direction. By contrast, within Japan, the propaganda machine worked overtime. The Imperial News Agency declared that minor losses were sustained near Midway, but censors could not contain the whispers spreading through naval circles. Officers who had once laughed at the American clumsiness now questioned their own arrogance. The once supreme Codebreakers, the carrier strike force that had terrorized the Pacific, no longer existed. The rising sun had dimmed, and no slogan could make it shine again. In the months that followed, the shock of Midway echoed across the Pacific and far beyond. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once feared as the unstoppable spear of conquest, now found itself grasping at recovery. 4 of its 6 frontline carriers gone. Over 300 of its most experienced airmen gone. And with them, the aura of invincibility that had shadowed Japan since Pearl Harbor. Gone forever. The defeat could not be undone. No amount of new ships could replace the human mastery that had been lost. The Navy began training new pilots at a frantic pace, but most were rushed into combat with only a few dozen flight hours, a shadow of the rigorous training that had produced the Midway veterans. By 1943, Japan's carrier decks would be filled with youth, brave but untested. The Empire's strategic edge had begun to dull. In contrast, the United States had found its rhythm. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego worked around the clock. Aircraft carriers that had been mere blueprints were now steel realities. New Essex-class carriers began rolling off production lines with astonishing speed, vast floating fortresses, each carrying more aircraft, armor, and firepower than any before them. The pilots of the U.S. Navy, once dismissed as amateurs, now trained with precision born from both fear and pride. They studied the failures of Coral Sea and the lessons of Midway, transforming every loss into doctrine. Radar integration, coordinated strikes, and fighter escort tactics became second nature. The Navy that emerged from Midway was not just stronger, it was smarter. Midway also transformed the psychology of command. Admiral Nimitz's calm confidence and willingness to trust intelligence rather than instinct became the new standard. The success of code-breaking changed warfare itself. No longer was victory decided solely by ships and planes. Now it was won in silence, in the unseen rooms where information became a weapon sharper than any torpedo. For Japan, this shift was invisible and fatal. Believing that fate and courage alone could win wars, the Imperial Command failed to grasp that technology, data, and adaptability had rewritten the rules of conflict. Midway was not just a defeat of arms. It was the collapse of an outdated mindset. In the broader world, the battle's outcome resonated deeply. In London, Winston Churchill received the news with visible relief. The Pacific, once thought lost to Japanese dominance, now seemed balanced again. The Allies, reeling from setbacks across Asia, could finally breathe. The United States had not only avenged Pearl Harbor, it had proven itself as a global naval power. Even in Berlin, the implications were clear. Hitler, frustrated by the slow progress on the Eastern Front, reportedly raged upon hearing of Japan's losses. His hopes for a two-front squeeze on the Allies had dimmed. Midway ensured that the Pacific would not collapse, it would fight back. Meanwhile, within Japan's military circles, doubt began to grow like a quiet sickness. Survivors from the battle spoke in hushed tones of burning decks, exploding munitions, and the eerie sight of American dive bombers appearing from nowhere. The precision of the American attack was unlike anything they had faced before. Even officers loyal to the Emperor whispered of broken luck, a dangerous phrase in a culture built on divine destiny. One Japanese admiral, in a private reflection, wrote later, "At Midway the gods left us. We fought with courage, but courage alone was no longer enough." That realization, unspoken but understood, would haunt Japan's naval doctrine until the end of the war. By early 1943, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The United States began its island-hopping campaign, inch by inch reclaiming the Pacific. Each new carrier launched, each radar tower erected, each pilot trained, all of it traced back to Midway. It was the spark that ignited America's full industrial and strategic potential. The Japanese Empire, once the hunter, now became the hunted. Every island lost, every convoy sunk, every airfield destroyed, was a reminder of the morning they believed they could not be touched. Midway had humbled a superpower, and it had taught the world a brutal truth. In modern warfare, arrogance dies faster than men. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Even today, the wrecks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest silently on the Pacific floor, monuments of pride turned into lessons. Coral now clings to their twisted steel. Fish swim through shattered hangars where once the rising sun banners waved proudly. The sea, indifferent yet eternal, holds both victory and defeat in the same embrace. Midway was not just a battle. It was a revelation. It showed that information could win where strength alone could not, that unseen minds behind radio intercepts and decoding machines could shift the fate of nations. It marked the moment when courage met calculation, and for the first time, technology became the equal of bravery. For the Americans, Midway was proof that resilience, intelligence, and unity could overcome even the mightiest empire. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of reflection, the slow realization that no nation, no matter how disciplined or proud, is immune to consequence. And for the world, it became a timeless story of balance, how arrogance in victory can be as dangerous as fear in defeat. In the burning sky over the Pacific, humanity saw its own reflection, brilliant, destructive, yet capable of learning. When we remember Midway, we don't just recall ships or planes. We remember people, Pilots who never returned, cryptanalysts who fought wars with pencils, leaders who carried the weight of impossible choices. Their legacy is written not just in history books, but in every act of courage that follows reason, and every act of reason that saves courage from ruin. As the sun sets over the Pacific once more, the water glows faintly red, as if still remembering. The lesson of Midway endures. Those who underestimate knowledge will one day kneel before it. Military medal. This was Japanese captains claimed no one could reach Midway until the sky caught fire with bombs. If you believe real history should be told with truth and cinematic realism, subscribe to WWII Heroic Realism, where every story honors those who fought and the lessons they left behind.